This is your 8x8 grid that should accompany your fountain square grid when completing the sandbag portion of the A Conflict Dogtag Easter egg. What you first want to do when starting to draw this table from scratch is draw an 8x8 grid. This comprises of 9 horizontal lines and 9 vertical lines. 9 horizontal lines, 9 vertical lines. What I recommend afterwards is drawing extending lines that act as housing spaces for the numbers that you will soon discover by activating the E-flag building pillars in pairs. The letters that you see here, I've just simply drawn so that if you decide to watch one of my walkthroughs and where I describe some of the positions within this grid, you understand what I mean by this. So when I say row A, column A, I mean this grid. Let me now demonstrate with an example of how you might fill out this grid. For example, so this is what I would do when I'm attempting this Easter egg. I like to use 4 and 5 pillars as my reference point or the first starting position when I attempt this Easter egg. These are the 2 pillars closest by the door that faces the German spad or the fountain square. When I activate these pillars, let's say that a light activates in this corner. What I would do is mark this as 4 and 5. This doesn't tell me anything initially because I don't know whether the 4 or the 5 are either a row or column. Let's say I now activate 4 and 6. Therefore, I keep 4 as my reference number for potentially determining whether this is my row, therefore 4, so row A would be 4, or whether 4 is a column, therefore A would be column 4. But in this example, 4 was kept as the reference number, and therefore with these two horizontal to each other, I have now determined 3 pieces of information. I have determined that 4 is my row, and that 5 and 6 are my columns. Now, what I would like to do after this is determine what the rest of these columns and rows are. So using 4 as my reference number, so therefore I keep 4, the first number that I activate in my pillar or building pillar pairs, I can try and attempt or deduce what the rest of my column numbers are. And in terms of my example for the letterings, this would be row A, column A, and this 4 and 6 would be row A, column B. Now, if I activate more numbers, let's say this is number 8, I am not going to write down 4, 8, because this is not a definitive piece of information. I already know that row 4 is I already know that row A is 4, and therefore this will have to be column 8. This is not a defining piece of information. I already made an educated guess. Now, what I want to do is use 4 to determine all these other rows, and then using a reference number like 5 as a reference column, I want to then, after I've discovered all of my column numbers, I want to use column 5 to deduce all my row numbers. So if we use this as an example, now I have activated all the lights here and activated all the lights here. Now, let's say that this was a light pad position that I will mark with a circle. This Easter egg randomizes which numbers are the columns and which number are the rows, and it will also randomize which of these positions you must activate in terms of the light positions. I can now begin to turn off the lights for these rows and columns, except for one. And this will be 4 and 8 because it's already my light bag position. I have turned it on. I will mark it with a checkbox so I know. And then I will begin to turn off what I've turned on here for this row and this column here. If I, for example, have a light bag position here, I will not turn it off because it's my light bag position, and I will mark it with a check. Hopefully you don't bleed your checks through your other grid zones, otherwise that would most likely be infuriating. Please don't do that. And now, let's say I've discovered other numbers, so like let's say this is 3, 7, and I have like stuff like here. Let's say this is row 9. I can, oh, goodness me. Let's say this is row 9, which should be the easiest number to draw, but apparently not. I can now activate because I've deduced my rows. This row is 9, this column is 3. I activate pillars 9 and 3 and mark it with a check. Now, ultimately, these are only 4 sandbag positions. You will have to activate 8 more if you were attempting an example like this, for a total of up to 12 sandbag, or therefore 12 light positions. Apologies. Another tip that I recommend is that you highlight your corners. Once again, that you might do so in your fountain square grid. So therefore you can more easily translate your sandbag positions into the light square positions. So for example, this is my green zone, this is my yellow zone corner, my orange zone, and my red zone. Let me finish off marking these, and this is why it's very important to orientate your corners, which is why I highly recommend doing this. And there we have it. So once again, this is your green zone, this is my yellow zone, this is my orange zone, and this is my red zone. So therefore, if I was looking through here, I could also mark, as I like to do my walkthroughs, mark the plus sign here. So using my light pad positions as an example, I know that this is in the red zone and it's the one closest to the middle. This is a yellow corner. This is a yellow, also a yellow zone, but it's more to the right of this corner. This is a red zone position. It's not quite close to the middle, but it's also not quite close to the corner. It's in the middle between the two. And I think I covered all of them, but let's just say that one's here and one is here. So that makes a total of 6 out of the possible 12. So this is a green corner, and this is an orange middle, because this is my orange zone. So hopefully this helps you to determine how to translate your sandbag positions into your light zone grid positions. And so if I was to further describe these positions as I might do so in my walkthrough, this would be row F, column A. This would be row E, column E. This would be row A, column E. This would be row D, column G. And this would be row C, column F, for a few examples. I wish you all the best in your Easter egg attempt, and hopefully this has helped you out a lot. So ultimately, this is what your fountain square grid and 8x8 light zone grid should look like. As I recommended, they should be on the same piece of paper. I have color coordinated this, but you do not have to do so. I've just assumed that the player doing this is a beginner. As we can see, there are 12 X's on the fountain square grid, corresponding to 12 circles on the Lightzone grid. I was lucky to get row A as 4 in one of my tutorials, but this may not be the case. Row A could be something like number 9. So then I would use number 9 as my reference row and whatever's column A as my reference column, or specifically that number will be activated within the pair that translates to the A column. So when I use number 9, for example, as my row A reference number, I will use number 9 for all of my pairs to discover columns E through H. But when I turn these off eventually, I will leave row A, column D, and row A, column G light zone positions activated. If I'm using column A as my reference column, and I turn on all the lights for rows A through H, let's assume that number 5 is my column once again. I will use number 5 in my pillar pairings to activate rows A through H. When I eventually have discovered the identities of all the rows and all of the columns, now turning off all the lights on the columns, I will activate those pillar pairings again, but I will leave the pillar pairings row A, column A, and row E, column A still activated, as those are my two light zone positions for column A. You will notice that the fountain square grid's dimensions vary greatly to the 8x8 light zone grid positions. This is why I highly recommend orientating your corners as I've shown here, and also drawing a plus sign through your fountain square grid, your 8x8 grid, and eventually in-game when you draw your 8x8 grid with your MG machine gun. Remember, the top of the fountain square grid is facing northeast or more towards the German spawn, and your 8x8 light zone grid, the top of it faces the windows near the flagpole. So when you are viewing the top of your fountain square grid and the top of your light zone grid, the northeast side is your front and the windows are your front. Then this corresponds to the positions on your paper drawn here. I understand that the color coordinates may be confusing, so here's another version of the paper I have just shown you without the colors. You can still notice that the corners are orientated, my zones are split for my fountain square grid, and I've drawn a plus sign with Sharpie through the middle of both my graphs.